Welcome to The Two-Handed Economist with John Diamond, where we look at issues from all the angles. President Truman once asked for a one-handed economist because he wanted someone to help make decisions and to not always say on the other hand. In this podcast, we try to look at every issue from multiple angles in order to reach the best solution to the problems at hand. Today is Tuesday, June 3rd, and we've got two big issues brewing for the past couple of weeks. First, we have a major tax and spending bill working its way through Congress. It's dubbed the Big Beautiful Bill. It passed the House in late May and has made its way to the Senate. The goal is to get this bill to the president by July 4th. And just when you thought trade policy couldn't be any more uncertain, a major court ruling has thrown trade and tariff debates into chaos. And so we will discuss that issue. Let's start with the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. The House passed the bill 215 to 214 at the end of May, and it's under consideration in the Senate. The Big Beautiful Bill extends many of the individual provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It enacts many of the tax promises made by President Trump on the campaign trail, such as no tax on tips, overtime, or Social Security benefits. At least it enacts some form of those things, but it may not do them exactly, as we'll discuss. It also cuts spending and it raises the debt limit. But the bill makes some odd changes due to constraints of using the reconciliation process. For example, instead of eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits, a move constrained by Senate budget rules, the bill proposes a $4,000 additional standard deduction for individuals age 65 and older. This deduction is available regardless of whether the individual receives Social Security benefits, potentially benefiting retired federal workers and others without such income. But the major criticism of the One Big Beautiful Bill is the temporary nature of several key provisions, which undermines both fiscal certainty and long-run economic planning. Notably, the bill extends full expensing and business investments and reinstates more generous R&D cost recovery rules, but only for a limited number of years. These temporary measures may boost investment in the short run, but they create a cliff effect that encourages periods of over and underinvestment in the years to come. This structure mirrors the shortcomings of the 2017 tax law, where expiring provisions led to uncertainty and future pressure to extend costly tax breaks. Another problem with the bill is its impact on the debt. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will significantly increase the federal deficit over the next decade. Specifically, CBO projects that the bill would add approximately $2.3 trillion to the deficit from 2025 to 2034. Adding the cost of financing this additional debt, i.e. the interest payments you have to make on the debt, raises the total deficit to up to $3.1 trillion. If any of the temporary policies are extended in the future, or if any of the spending cuts are reduced or not put in place, the bill would have an even larger impact on the debt. The bill reduces federal revenues by about $3.8 trillion over the next 10 years. These reductions are offset by proposed spending cuts, such as nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid and roughly $300 million from various nutrition programs. These reductions are insufficient to offset the total revenue losses from the tax cuts. One of the biggest debates around the One Big Beautiful Bill is its impact on economic growth. Supporters argue that extending the 2017 tax cuts and increasing expensing of investment will boost investment and job creation. The Tax Foundation estimates it could raise long-term GDP by around 0.8%, not nearly enough to offset the cost of the tax cuts. And the Congressional Budget Office warns that the bill's $2 to $3 trillion deficits could drive up interest rates and crowd out private investment, thus offsetting some of the positive benefits. On the other hand, the White House Council of Economic Advisors has projected that the One Big Beautiful Bill could boost U.S. GDP by 4.2 to 4.5% in the short run, or 2.9 to 3.5% in the long run. Numbers that are truly too large to believe. In fact, they're too large to be true, and they're not true. They won't be true. Not in this world. They attribute this growth to supply-side incentives such as tax cuts on overtime and tips, expanded business deductions, and manufacturing incentives. However, these projections have been met with widespread skepticism from independent analysts. For instance, the Penn Wharton budget model estimates a more modest GDP increase of 0.5% by 2034, assuming certain conditions like the rollback of tariffs occur. The Joint Committee on Taxation suggests an annual growth increase of just 0.03 percentage points. Yes, 0.03, so you can add 2 more decimal places. We could have just said 0 and been pretty accurate there. The CEA's overly optimistic forecasts rely on assumptions that just aren't accepted in mainstream economics. One of the core problems of the Big Beautiful Bill is its reliance on temporary provisions to mask its true cost. Key elements such as full expensing and R&D deductions phase out within a few years, creating uncertainty for businesses and undermining long-term investment. Meanwhile, the bill still adds over $2 trillion to the deficit, according to the CBO, even if those expirations are allowed, which is unlikely. If Congress extends these temporary tax breaks in the future, the true cost could balloon to more than $3 trillion. This approach kicks the fiscal can down the road, leaving future lawmakers to deal with mounting debt and structural budget gaps. Another thing we've heard this week is a lot of shade and criticism thrown at the Congressional Budget Office. Speaker Mike Johnson has been very critical of CBO recently in the press. I think that criticism is unwarranted. CBO has a very difficult job in estimating the impacts of major legislation for the next 10 years. That's an impossible task, yet they do it fairly well. If we look at their past projections, are they wrong sometimes? Absolutely. But sometimes are they pretty close? Yes, they are. Let's take, for example, the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. We heard these same arguments that cutting taxes was going to increase growth and that would raise enough revenue so the bill would not increase the debt. CBO did not agree, and their initial estimates were that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act would lead to an increase in the deficit and debt after it was passed over the next 10 years. And what we see in the data is that they were right. So from 2017 to 2019, the debt to GDP ratio increased from 104% to 107%. Now, we can't go beyond 2019 because in 2020, COVID occurred and the debt increased massively due to that, and we don't want to attribute that to the bill. But the short-term effects, at least, of the 2017 tax cut was a 3 percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio, which clearly shows that while there were definitely positive impacts from the 2017 Tax Act, they weren't large enough to fully offset the reduction in revenues from cutting tax rates. And that tax act, the 2017 Act, was almost definitely a more pro-growth reform than the current bill for 2 reasons. First, the 2017 Act cut corporate rates from 35% to 21%. A major reduction in the corporate tax rate is sure to drive investment and employment growth, leading to more tax revenue that'll offset the cost of reducing taxes. The current bill is not reducing the corporate tax rate. And so we won't see that same growth impact from this bill. Second, the 2017 Act contained a substantial amount of base broadening, and much of that was in the form of the SALT cap, so the cap on state and local income tax deductions, which was at the time reduced to $10,000. Unfortunately, the One Big Beautiful Bill is once again spending money by increasing the SALT cap back to $40,000. This will be a tax giveaway to the rich, and it will reduce economic growth, not expand it. Overall, I don't see any way in which the current bill will increase growth to the level that the 2017 Act did. So any of the arguments built on this bill is going to increase growth enough to offset roughly $2.4 trillion in revenue declines is simply untrue and won't happen. Now let's turn to trade policy. Last week, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that President Trump exceeded his authority by imposing sweeping tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The court ordered the administration to rescind these tariffs within 10 days. However, a federal appeals court temporarily reinstated the tariffs, allowing them to remain in effect pending further legal proceedings. The White House has criticized the court's decision and called for the Supreme Court to overturn the ruling, arguing it threatens U.S. credibility internationally. President Trump warned that removing these tariffs could lead to economic ruination, emphasizing their role in protecting American industries. In response to the court's ruling, President Trump announced plans to double tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50%, effective June 4, 2025. He stated that this move aims to bolster the U.S. steel industry and counteract what he describes as shoddy foreign products, particularly from China. The administration is dead set on continuing its tariff and trade policies, no matter the legal outcomes, and they have means to do this. Internationally, the tariff hike has drawn criticism. Canada, a major supplier of steel and aluminum to the U.S., warned of catastrophic impacts on its industries and is considering retaliatory measures. The European Commission has also expressed concerns and hopes to negotiate tariff reductions with U.S. officials. While intended to protect domestic industry, the moves have sparked economic and diplomatic tensions both domestically and internationally. Uncertainty and the negative impacts of tariffs will continue in the short and long term, and they will reduce short and long-term economic growth. You can expect more headlines, more ambiguity in the weeks ahead. So to close up, here's what you should take away from this week. The One Big Beautiful Bill may look flashy, but it's built on shaky ground. Temporary tax breaks mask the real cost. And if they're extended, as they almost certainly will be, the bill would add more than $3 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. It's a fiscal illusion wrapped in political branding, and it pushes tough decisions onto the next Congress. And while the White House promises explosive economic growth, independent analysts aren't buying it, and neither am I. Growth forecasts from the CEA are wildly optimistic and completely unsupported by the data. The administration also is doubling down on tariffs, which could only further reduce U.S. economic growth, making our deficit and debt problems even worse. That means more legal drama and more economic uncertainty, particularly for U.S. manufacturers and our global trade partners, are coming down the pike. That's it for this week's episode of The Two-Handed Economist. Thanks for tuning in. The Two-Handed Economist is produced by the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Production support was provided by Karina Zamel, Shannon Moriarty, and Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org for more, and thank you for listening.